You were never meant to hear this. In fact, the men who wrote the history books made sure of it. They buried it beneath the silver dust of Leadville, Colorado, 1881, a year when fortunes were made in hours and lives disappeared in silence. The official record speaks of boomtown wealth, of saloons and opera houses, of pioneers carving order out of wilderness. But what they don't tell you is this. Under the floorboards of one saloon, investigators uncovered something that no honest town could explain. 23 sets of women's clothing, folded neatly like merchandise, each bundle tagged with a name, an age, a description, and a price. Think about that for a moment. Not lost property, not discarded rags, but catalogued possessions, notes attached with a cold precision that reduces a human being to the language of livestock. Now imagine this. Those women had vanished months before, yet their belongings remained, archived like artifacts of stolen lives. The building belonged to two sisters, Catherine and Margaret McKenna. To the town of Leadville, they were businesswomen, providers of hospitality in a rough and lawless mining camp. But beneath the polished mahogany of their bar, behind their warm smiles and polite questions about your family back home, was a machine, a system, one that turned human beings into commodities, hidden in plain sight while the silver boom roared. What was discovered, that winter was not an isolated crime. It was a glimpse into something larger, a network, a shadow economy thriving beneath the chaos of the Wild West, stretching its tendrils from Colorado to San Francisco. It's not the story you'll read in textbooks about frontier life. This is the story they scrubbed away, because it reveals how corruption and hunger for profit can disguise themselves behind civility, behind charity, behind the illusion of care. And if you think this story is only about the past, you're wrong. What happened in Leadville in 1881 is the same story unfolding today. Different faces, different tools, but the same manipulation of trust, the same harvesting of the vulnerable, the same silence from those who benefit most. This isn't history for the faint of heart. This is forbidden knowledge, the kind that, once heard, can never be forgotten. Leadville in 1881 was not just a mining camp. It was a furnace where greed and desperation fused into something monstrous. 30,000 people packed into a valley of mud, snow, and silver ore. Men clawed at the mountains like starving wolves, believing each shovel might reveal their salvation. And yet, for every man who struck it rich, 100 more drowned themselves in whiskey, gambling, and the false comfort of women they could barely afford. It was a place where law and morality bent under the weight of money. The McKenna sisters understood this truth better than most. On the surface, they were saviors. They offered food, shelter, and employment to young women traveling west. Their saloon was praised as cleaner, more refined than the filthy dens run by other proprietors. Churchmen applauded them. Newspapers called them angels of mercy. But you need to understand something vital. When society elevates someone too quickly, when praise feels rehearsed, when reputations glitter too brightly, that's when you should look for rot beneath the shine. Catherine, the elder, had a mind like a steel trap. She remembered every detail, every weakness. A man would confess his loneliness over a drink, never realizing he was feeding her ledger. Information stored, categorized, and weaponized. Margaret, the younger, possessed a gentleness that lowered defenses. She could sense which girls had no one coming to look for them, no fathers, brothers, or husbands who would ask questions. Together, the sisters performed a calculated theatre of compassion, all smiles and charity above the floorboards, but meticulous cruelty beneath them. This is the psychology of control. It's never about brute force at first. It's about trust. You lull the victim with kindness, make them believe they've found safe harbor, and only when their guard is down do you reveal the trap. The McKenna sisters weren't anomalies. They were participants in an economy built on the exploitation of vulnerability. They turned desperation into currency. They sold the illusion of security in a land where everything was uncertain. And the town. The town looked away. Because as long as the whiskey flowed, as long as fortunes were made and pleasures were satisfied, nobody wanted to believe the angels of mercy might be predators in disguise. But the ledger under the floorboards did not lie. It whispered the truth no one wanted to hear, that even in the promise of the American West, some lives were worth nothing more than a number and a price tag. The first crack in the McKenna sisters' illusion did not come from Leadville itself. The townsfolk were too blinded, too comfortable in their belief that these women were benevolent. No, the truth arrived in the form of a letter, a desperate plea that crossed mountains and deserts to land on the desk of Marshal William Dugan in November of 1880. The envelope was worn, water-stained, trembling with fear in its handwriting. Inside, 8 pages of cramped words spilled out the agony of a young woman named Emma Kowalski. She claimed she had escaped from a brothel in San Francisco's infamous Barbary Coast, but she wasn't writing for herself. She was searching for her sister, Anna, who had vanished months before. Emma's account was harrowing. She and Anna had lost everything in a fire in Chicago. Parents dead, savings gone. They followed the Western dream, believing in opportunity, in new beginnings. Along the way, they heard of the McKenna sisters, kind Irish women who offered food, work, and safety to young women in Colorado. By the time Emma and Anna arrived in Leadville, starving and exhausted, the sisters' warm welcome must have felt like salvation. Hot soup, clean clothes, gentle words. For the first week, kindness wrapped them like a blanket. Catherine asked questions about their skills, their family, their hopes. Margaret soothed them with maternal calm. But then came the dinner. Roast beef, fresh bread, even cake. The kind of meal no struggling migrant girl could resist. That night, both Emma and Anna felt an unnatural drowsiness, the edges of the world softening. By morning, Emma woke bound in a wagon, head pounding, from the bitter taste of laudanum. Anna lay unconscious beside her. A strange man drove the wagon, joking with Catherine as if this were nothing more than routine. The merchandise, he called them. Paid for. Sold. Emma described the weeks that followed in hellish detail. Wagons, trains, ships, always guarded, always silenced, always drugged when they resisted. Dozens of girls like them, funneled westward, their lives erased, their futures already priced. Most never made it back. Emma did. But her sister did. Not. Her words, carved through Marshal Dugan's hardened heart. He had known the McKenna sisters. He had shared drinks with them, trusted them. And now he held in his hands a letter that suggested they were not angels of mercy, but gatekeepers to a nightmare machine of human trafficking, operating in plain sight beneath the roar of the silver boom. Marshal William Dugan was no stranger to violence. He had seen miners beaten to death over poker hands, men shot in the street for debts, families ruined in a single night of gambling. But nothing he had encountered in 15 years of frontier law prepared him for Emma's letter. It was too detailed, too personal, too precise to dismiss. She described Catherine's peculiar way of tilting her head when thinking, Margaret's habit of humming under her breath while she worked, the mahogany bar polished so bright you could see your reflection. These were not inventions. These were truths only an insider could know. And yet, the implications were almost unthinkable. Could 2 women so respected, so praised by the town's most powerful voices, really be trafficking girls into the darkest corners of the West? To act meant to question not only the sisters, but the system that protected them. Dugan knew the danger. The mining barons, the saloon owners, the politicians, all thrived on the chaos of Leadville. They needed the illusion of order, but not too much order. As long as the McKenna sisters kept their business discreet, who would benefit from exposing them? Still, Dugan began quietly digging. He pulled records of missing women, searching for patterns. He spoke to merchants about the sisters' unusual shipments, wagons traveling late at night, sometimes guarded by men with no business in town. He noticed the girls who came to the saloon and then did not return. Always the same story. She found work out west. She moved on. She left in the night. But no letters ever arrived from those women. No wages were sent back home. Their existence ended the moment they walked through the McKenna sisters' doors. And under the floorboards years later, the evidence confirmed it. 23 bundles of clothing, each tagged with a name, an inventory, a ledger of human souls. But here's the truth most people never face. The McKenna sisters were not alone. They were a cog in a larger wheel. From Colorado to San Francisco, an entire pipeline existed, a silent trade that treated human lives as product. The frontier was not just a place of opportunity, it was a marketplace of flesh, sanctioned by silence and protected by profit. When Dugan realized this, he also realized something darker. If he pursued this investigation, he would not just be fighting two sisters. He would be fighting the very structure of power that held Leadville together. The mask of civility in Leadville was always thin. Behind every polished bar, every handshake at a town meeting, every sermon preached about progress and morality, there was rot. Marshal Dugan knew it the moment he started asking questions. At first, people listened. They leaned in, interested. But when he mentioned the McKenna sisters by name, conversations grew short, eyes shifted, and doors quietly closed. It was not fear of the sisters themselves. No. It was fear of what lay behind them. Miners whispered about wagons leaving town under cover of night, guarded by hired men whose services did not come cheap. Merchants spoke of ledgers balanced with mysterious payments, debts forgiven, in exchange for silence. And always there was the unspoken truth. Too many powerful men enjoyed the supply of women that the pipeline delivered. To investigate too deeply meant cutting into the arteries of pleasure, profit, and influence. This is how systems of corruption survive, not because everyone is guilty, but because enough people benefit. And those who benefit build walls of silence around the crime. The McKenna sisters had built their empire not on violence alone, but on perception. They appeared charitable, respectable. They convinced the church they were virtuous. They convinced businessmen they were useful. They convinced lawmen they were harmless, and in that illusion, they were untouchable. But illusions cannot hide the truth forever. Emma's letter had lit a fuse. The moment Dugan began piecing together the pattern of missing girls, the facade started to crack. He traced names written in the bundles of clothing to families back east, families who had received letters full of promises that suddenly went silent. He discovered that girls who entered the McKenna Saloon often traveled westward by train within weeks, always escorted, always vanishing at the California coast. The sisters' brilliance was in their duality. Catherine, with her burning eyes and sharp tongue, gathered information and identified prey. Margaret, with her calm voice and gentle touch, disarmed suspicion. Together, they built a machine that fed the hunger of men and the coffers of syndicates, stretching far beyond Colorado. And here lies the darker revelation. The McKenna sisters were not monsters born of madness. They were businesswomen. They used the very principles of commerce and networking that America celebrated. Only they applied them to human lives. The frontier praised ambition, cunning, and efficiency. The sisters merely took those virtues to their logical, horrifying extreme. The myth of the Wild West has always been a lie. They told you it was about freedom, about brave men carving a new life out of the wilderness. They gave you gunfighters and lawmen, gold rushes and railroads, a story of grit and opportunity. But beneath that story was a perfect stage for something else entirely. Exploitation. Think about it. A land filled with transients, men who came alone, worked hard, and spent fast. Women who arrived with nothing but hope, cut off from family, far from protection. Towns that rose overnight and vanished just as quickly. Who would question a missing person in a place where nobody stayed for long? Who would demand answers when the frontier itself swallowed people whole every single day? The McKenna sisters understood this stage better than most. They weren't simply predators. They were strategists. They weaponized the chaos of the frontier. Every wagon road, every mining camp, every railroad line became part of a larger map. Girls weren't disappearing randomly. They were being processed, like shipments of ore from the mountains, transported from one point to another, catalogued, broken down, consumed. The Wild West wasn't just lawless, it was profitable precisely because it was lawless. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This system thrived because the culture allowed it. Men who arrived desperate for comfort didn't ask where the women came from. They didn't want to know. Businessmen who profited from booming economies didn't ask why saloons always seemed supplied with fresh faces. Politicians didn't ask where their campaign donations originated. Ignorance was convenient. Silence was profitable. This is how control operates, not just with chains or ropes, but with stories. The official story of the frontier was one of adventure. The hidden story was one of consumption. By distracting the masses with gunfights and fortunes, the true machinery could grind on unseen. The McKenna sisters were not an aberration. They were evidence of the design. When we look at history this way, the frontier becomes less about individual heroism and more about institutionalized predation. And that is why this tale was buried. Because if you see the truth of Leadville in 1881, you begin to see the same patterns today, hidden behind different myths, but driven by the same hunger. Emma Kowalski's escape should have been impossible. Systems like these are designed to be airtight. No loose ends, no survivors, no testimony. Yet somehow, she slipped through. That fact alone tells us something important. Even the most controlled structures carry fractures. The truth always leaks out, no matter how carefully it's buried. When Emma's letter arrived in Leadville, it wasn't just a cry for help, it was a virus. Words on fragile paper, smudged with tears and fear, but containing the power to unravel the illusion the McKenna sisters had built. She wrote of being drugged, bound, sold like livestock. She wrote of the long journey west, the trading hands, the men who laughed as they negotiated her value. She described faces, voices, gestures, details only an eyewitness could know. That letter didn't just accuse two women of betrayal. It illuminated an entire hidden economy, an economy that thrived in the shadows of the silver boom, fed by the same desperation that fueled the mines. Men dug for ore. Women were mined for flesh. Both were extracted, transported, sold. Both were chewed up by a machine that pretended to promise prosperity. But here's where the darkness deepens. When Marshal William Dugan read Emma's account, he didn't just see two saloon keepers turned criminals. He recognized names. He recognized networks. The buyers weren't strangers. They were men who drank at his table, men who donated to civic projects, men who wore the mask of respectability. To investigate Emma's words meant tearing into the very heart of Leadville's social order, and that is why her letter was dangerous. Not because it accused criminals, but because it revealed the respectable as complicit. Understand this. Systems of exploitation never exist in isolation. They are sustained by silence at the top. The McKenna sisters didn't vanish 3 days before the raid because they were lucky. They vanished because someone warned them, someone with influence, someone with access to the investigation, someone who had more to lose if the truth surfaced. That disappearance was the system protecting itself. Emma had cracked the surface, but she was still just one voice. For her, testimony to matter, it had to be believed. And belief in her meant disbelief in the official story. And that, my friend, is always the most dangerous choice a man can make. Respectability. That word has always been the greatest disguise. The McKenna sisters weren't the monsters hiding in shadows. They were the women smiling in daylight, serving drinks, offering charity, speaking kindly to neighbors. That was their camouflage. But it wasn't theirs alone. Leadville itself was built on this duplicity. a theatre of decency covering a furnace of corruption. Think of the men who sat in church pews on Sunday, who bowed their heads during sermons about sin, only to spend Monday night buying women, who never chose to be there. Think of the businessmen who donated money for schools and hospitals, all while profiting from the trafficking routes that supplied Leadville's saloons and brothels. Think of the judges and sheriffs who wore the badge of law but looked the other way when the missing multiplied. These weren't contradictions. They were the system. The McKenna sisters played their part with precision. Catherine charmed the powerful, reminding each man of his importance, making him feel seen. Margaret played the motherly figure, speaking of virtue and care. Together, they built a mask so flawless that even the most suspicious minds hesitated to question them. Respectability disarmed suspicion. It always does. And here lies the deeper lesson. Exploitation doesn't survive by hiding in darkness. It survives by cloaking itself in legitimacy. It thrives under titles, uniforms, and reputations. It thrives because men convince themselves that the mask must be real. They want to believe the story of order and progress. They want to believe they live in a town of opportunity, not a marketplace of flesh. The lie is more comfortable than the truth. Leadville's elites knew this. That's why the McKenna sisters had allies. When the floorboards of their saloon revealed bundles of women's clothes, when names and ages were written out like ledger entries, the whispers started. But so did the silence. Because to admit what those clothes meant was to admit the town's complicity. To confront the truth was to tear the mask away, and no one wanted to look into that mirror. So the respectable men did what respectable men always do when their comfort is threatened. They buried it. They called Emma's testimony hysteria. They downplayed the findings as misunderstood evidence. They twisted the narrative into one that blamed the victims, and history nearly followed their script. Nearly. Silence. It is the most effective weapon ever forged by power, not the gun, not the noose. Silence. Because silence erases. It makes the truth invisible, unprovable, unbelievable. And in Leadville, silence became the law. When Emma's letter spread among the authorities, a decision was made, not in public, not in court, but in whispers behind closed doors. The discovery beneath the floorboards should have sparked outrage. 23 sets of clothing, carefully folded, marked, with names and prices. That was evidence of commerce in human lives. Yet what happened? The evidence was filed away. Reports were lost. Witnesses were dismissed as unreliable. The story became rumor, then ghost story, then nothing. The silence swallowed it whole. But silence is never accidental. It is cultivated. It is enforced. For the men of Leadville's upper circle, silence protected more than just their reputations. It protected the machine. If too many questions were asked, supply lines would be disrupted. Profits would wither. The flow of desperate girls from Chicago, St. Louis, or Ireland itself would dry up. And when money stops moving, men in power grow nervous. So silence became the shield. This isn't just history. It is a pattern. Look closely, and you'll see it repeated in every age. Institutions cover scandal with silence. Governments bury atrocities with silence. Churches, corporations, even families use silence to erase the uncomfortable. And the most dangerous part, once the silence sets in, people adapt. They learn not to ask questions. They accept the gaps. They call it mystery instead of what it truly is, suppression. Leadville's citizens became complicit in that silence, some out of fear, others out of convenience. The miners who drank at the McKenna Saloon didn't want to believe they had been shaking hands with predators. The preachers who praised the sisters as angels didn't want to admit they had been fooled. To speak the truth meant admitting weakness, failure, and complicity. So they chose silence. But here's the danger no one sees. Silence doesn't erase corruption. It feeds it. Every buried truth strengthens the system. Every unanswered question becomes another lock on the prison door. Leadville wasn't just haunted by what the McKenna sisters did. It was haunted by what everyone else refused to say. Silence does not just conceal, it transforms. It reshapes communities into accomplices without them ever signing their names. That is the true horror of Leadville in 1881. Not simply that Catherine and Margaret McKenna preyed upon desperate and women, but that an entire town allowed itself to become an accessory. Think of it. A saloon on the busiest street in Leadville, a building everyone passed daily. Young women entering, smiling at first, promising to write home soon, then gone, vanished, and yet nobody asked where they went. Nobody questioned why letters home were never delivered, why trunks of clothing appeared in the sisters' possession without their owners. The town adjusted. The disappearances became background noise, absorbed into the chaos of frontier life. The people normalized it. That is the mechanism of psychological control. Evil rarely presents itself with horns and fire. It presents itself as routine. When a community becomes conditioned to accept disappearance, exploitation, and silence as just the way things are, they no longer resist. They adapt. And that adaptation is the death of conscience. This is how manipulation works. Not just through fear, but through erosion. The erosion of outrage. The erosion of questions. When people stop expecting answers, power wins. And in Leadville, the power wasn't just in the hands of saloon keepers or traffickers. It was in the institutions that reinforced the silence, the press that refused to print, the judges who dismissed cases, the businessmen who whispered warnings to their allies. That's how a system sustains itself, by convincing the masses that there's nothing to see. And here's the darkest truth. Once people accept silence, they begin to protect it. They defend the lie because it feels safer than facing the truth. How many men kept drinking at the McKenna Saloon because it was easier than admitting they were supporting monsters? How many church leaders stayed quiet because their own reputations were tied to the sisters they once praised? How many lawmen chose not to pursue justice because the cost of truth was too high? Leadville became a mirror of something much larger, the way societies turn into machines of complicity. Catherine and Margaret were predators, but it was the silence of thousands that allowed them to thrive. Silence was not just a shield, it was the true accomplice. When silence holds long enough, it doesn't remain empty. It mutates. It grows into myth. That is what happened in Leadville. The raw truth of trafficking, betrayal, and organized predation slowly blurred into ghost stories, barroom whispers, and local legends. The horror was not erased, it was transfigured. And that transformation served power just as effectively as silence. Listen carefully to how history remembers. The McKenna sisters did not remain in records as traffickers, manipulators, and architects of suffering. Instead, they became folklore. Some claimed their building was haunted. Others swore the sisters vanished into the mountains, perhaps taken by supernatural forces. Stories of curses, of phantom women walking Harrison Avenue, of strange sounds beneath the floorboards at night. All of it replaced the raw, documented evil. Do you see what happened there? The real story was too dangerous, too damning. So it was rewritten into one that entertained instead of condemned. The missing women became mysteries instead of victims. The sisters became legends instead of criminals. This is how systems bury the unbearable. They convert atrocity into entertainment. And the public accepts it because myth feels safer than fact. It is easier to tell children about haunted saloons than to admit entire towns profited from the sale of young women. It is easier to trade stories of curses than to face the curse of human greed. Myth anesthetizes the conscience. But myth is not harmless. It protects the guilty. It rewrites history to the benefit of those who constructed the silence in the first place. Even today, most who hear of the McKenna sisters encounter the ghost story first, not the testimony of Emma Kowalski. The legend survives because it is marketable. The truth remains buried because it indicts. And yet, buried truth still breathes. Every myth is a mask, but every mask leaves cracks. When you peer past the ghost stories of Leadville, when you strip away the convenient folklore, you see the machine underneath. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. This is the descent. Silence becomes myth, myth becomes history, and history becomes a prison. Unless someone dares to pull the mask away, unless someone demands to know why the myth exists in the first place. Emma Kowalski's letter was more than a desperate plea. It was an act of rebellion against the silence and against the myth-making machine already taking shape around the McKenna sisters. Think about it. In a world where paper itself was scarce, where every word cost sweat and survival, she chose to spend hours writing a testimony that she knew might never even reach its destination. That is not desperation alone. That is war. Her letter carried more than names and accusations. It carried a philosophy of truth. She described the wagon rides, the guards, the drugs slipped into food, the mocking laughter of men who discussed human beings as merchandise. She described the fear in Anna's face, the way her voice broke when she realized they weren't going to California for respectable jobs, but to be consumed. Emma's words cut deeper than any ghost story ever could, because they refused to mythologize. They documented, they indicted, they revealed. Understand what that means. She was forcing Leadville, and by extension all of us, to face the raw mechanics of corruption. She was ripping off the mask. Her words dared to declare that these women were not vanishing by accident, not slipping into the anonymity of the West, but being funneled through a system of organized predators who profited from the illusion of opportunity. And here is where the danger lies. Written truth is harder to erase than rumor. That's why testimonies like Emma's were so often suppressed, ridiculed, or lost in official files. Because once you read her words, you could never again see the McKenna Saloon as just another frontier business. You could never again laugh at ghost stories without hearing the screams beneath them. Emma's testimony is not simply a relic. It is a warning, a reminder that even in the darkest systems of control, a single voice can pierce through the silence. But it also asks a harder question. How many other voices were never heard? How many letters were destroyed? How many names never recorded? How many testimonies never written? That is the knife edge we stand on when we listen to Emma. Her voice was a crack in the mask, but only if we have the courage to hear it. Otherwise, even her truth becomes another layer of myth, another whisper in the wind, another story consumed instead of acted upon. When Emma's letter landed on the desk of Marshal William Dugan, it carried the weight of dynamite. But dynamite is only dangerous if you light the fuse. And in Leadville, every institution had a choice: ignite the truth or bury it under ash. What happened next revealed not only the fate of Emma's testimony, but the inner workings of the machine that keeps all forbidden truths silent. Dugan himself was shaken. He had known the McKenna sisters, drunk their whiskey, spoken to them, like neighbors. The letter forced him to confront a reality that tore at the foundation of his own identity as a lawman. That the people he trusted, the institutions he worked for, were entangled in something monstrous. But hesitation is deadly in such matters. Hesitation is what predators rely on. And Dugan hesitated. He brought the letter first to a judge. The judge read it with cold eyes and handed it back, muttering that accusations without respectable witnesses had no place in court. He brought it to the newspaper editor, who initially leaned forward with fascination, until he realized publishing the letter would implicate half the advertisers who kept his paper alive. The business elite, who supplied the saloons and profited from the constant churn of miners and travelers, would not tolerate disruption. The editor quietly folded the letter and suggested that printing ghost stories would sell better. Even the church leaders, men who had praised the sisters from their pulpits as symbols of civilizing virtue, recoiled when Dugan shared Emma's words. They preferred the safety of sermons about sin in the abstract, not the dangerous reality of sin in their own backyard. They too chose silence. Do you see the pattern? Emma's testimony was not dismissed because it lacked truth. It was buried because it had too much truth. truth that endangered profit, reputation, and the fragile illusion of order. Institutions exist to protect themselves first, and when the choice is between protecting innocence or protecting the system always wins. That is how corruption survives across centuries. The same mechanisms that shielded the McKenna sisters are alive today. Newspapers that entertain instead of expose, courts that dismiss instead of confront, churches that preach comfort instead of courage. The machinery of silence is eternal. And it is this machinery, not just the sisters themselves, that we must indict. Asterisk. The McKenna sisters were not isolated predators. They were nodes in a network, arteries in a hidden economy that stretched far beyond Leadville. To see them only as saloon keepers with dark secrets is to miss the larger map. Their establishment was a funnel, and the women they lured were not simply vanishing into the thin Colorado air. They were being transported, catalogued, and sold into a system that turned desperation into currency. Evidence surfaced during scattered investigations across the West. In Denver, authorities uncovered ledgers describing shipments of women, marked with initials that matched Catherine and Margaret's handwriting. In San Francisco's Barbary Coast, brothels suddenly received a surge of new arrivals, whose descriptions aligned with missing persons in Colorado and Kansas. And in railroad towns along the transcontinental line, witnesses whispered of guarded wagons carrying bound passengers, wagons that always seemed to disappear before reaching official stations. This was not chaos. It was structure. Every transaction, every disappearance, every vanished girl was part of a supply chain. The frontier was marketed as a place of opportunity, but for many, it became a hunting ground where the vulnerable were harvested like ore, and the sisters were efficient operators. Catherine's charisma disarmed suspicion. Margaret's meticulous records ensured no woman was taken without a price. Each bundle of clothing found beneath their floorboards was not just evidence of a crime, it was a receipt in a business that treated human souls as inventory. And what was the response of the so-called civilized world? Did newspapers scream of conspiracy? Did governments intervene to protect the vulnerable? No. The system profited too much from the exploitation. Brothels filled with trafficked women fed the mining towns with distraction and vice, keeping men pliant. Businessmen got their cut. Railroads moved more cargo. Officials were bribed to look the other way. This was not an aberration of the Wild West. It was the design. Understand this. When exploitation is organized, it ceases to look like crime. It begins to resemble commerce. And when commerce is allowed to mask cruelty, entire nations build themselves on the backs of the broken. The McKenna sisters were not just opportunists. They were agents of a hidden empire. Look closely at what the McKenna sisters built, and you'll see something unsettlingly familiar. A system that disguised exploitation as opportunity. A network that turned desperation into obedience. A machine that fed on silence. If that sounds like ancient history, it is only because you have not been taught to see the reflection staring back at you in the present. The trafficking routes of the 1880s were not just about women in wagons. They were about conditioning populations to accept control without resistance. The miners distracted by saloons and brothels. The newspapers lulled into printing ghost stories instead of truths. The businessmen enriching themselves while calling it progress. These are not relics. They are prototypes. And the same architecture is alive now, refined, global, and far more sophisticated. Today, the wagons have been replaced with algorithms, the brothels replaced with endless screens designed to capture your attention and strip your will. The ledgers are no longer handwritten notes beneath floorboards, but vast databases cataloging every movement, every desire, every weakness you reveal. Just as Catherine charmed her patrons into confessing secrets that could be used against them, today's systems coax you to give up your privacy willingly, disguising manipulation as entertainment, surveillance as convenience. The lesson is chilling. Exploitation doesn't end, it evolves. And just as Leadville became complicit in its own corruption by choosing silence, so too does modern society look away, while the machinery of control grows stronger. People know, deep down, they feel the manipulation pressing on them. But comfort, distraction, and denial feel safer than confrontation. Here's where you, watching this, must pause. Ask yourself, are you simply consuming another story? Or are you beginning to recognize the system behind the story? Because once you see the design, you can no longer play the role of a passive audience. You are called to awaken, to question, to resist the conditioning that wants you silent, entertained, and subdued. And to prove you are not just a listener, but a man stepping out of the trance. I want you to comment below the phrase, "No silence, no chains." Twice. Not once. Twice. Because repetition seals identity. Do it to mark the shift from being entertained by darkness to breaking free from it. That phrase is not for the algorithm, it is for you. The Wild West was never the story you were told. You were shown legends of grit, of men with rifles carving empires from wilderness, of saloons where fortunes rose and fell over whiskey and cards. But those stories were illusions, deliberate masks crafted to hide a darker reality. The frontier was not freedom, it was extraction, a theatre built on blood, greed, and silence. Consider this. The miners who rushed to Colorado, California, Nevada, they believed they were chasing fortune. But the true wealth wasn't theirs. It flowed upward, to the bankers in New York, to the railway barons, to the industrial families, who never once dirtied their hands with pickaxe or shovel. The miners bled their lungs with dust, their wives buried children in shallow graves, and the newspapers told them they were free men shaping their destiny. Do you see the trick? The illusion of autonomy while their bodies and labor were harvested like cattle. The McKenna sisters operated inside this system. They sold not just alcohol, but hope. They offered vulnerable women a taste of belonging, safety, even family, while secretly turning them into commodities. The frontier, you see, was not a land of opportunity, but a marketplace of flesh and soul. And the myth of rugged independence? That myth was the perfect camouflage. It kept men too proud to see they were slaves to forces far greater than any saloon keeper. It is no different today. The myths have changed costumes, but the theatre remains the same. The modern frontier is digital. Men believe they are free online, chasing wealth, fame, or connection. Yet the profits flow upward into the hands of corporations and hidden elites. Your labor, your data, your very attention, harvested and resold. Just as the miners' silver-fed bankers' coffers, your digital sweat feeds algorithms that know you better than you know yourself. The past was never over there. It is the blueprint you are standing on right now. If you want to understand why systems of control feel so inescapable, look back at Leadville in 1881. Look at the folded dresses beneath the saloon floorboards. Look at the girls who believed they had found sanctuary, but were walking into captivity. Then ask, where are the folded dresses of our age? What captives are hidden beneath today's polished floors? And more importantly, who profits from your blindness? When the McKenna sisters were praised in the newspapers as angels of mercy, the trap was sealed. That praise didn't just protect them, it sanctified them. It created the illusion of virtue so powerful that no one dared question what was happening behind the polished glass windows of their saloon. And this is how systems of control operate. They normalize captivity by cloaking it in morality. Think about it. The very institutions meant to protect the people, the church, the press, the law, all played their part in the deception. Priests blessed the sisters as Christian women bringing civilization to a rough town. The Leadville Herald-Democrat printed glowing articles about their charity. Local authorities, softened by soup delivered during illness, ignored the quiet disappearances of young women. Everyone wanted to believe in the image more than they wanted to confront the truth. And so, the traffickers thrived. Now pause and hold that mirror up to your world. What institutions are you told to trust today? Governments promising protection, corporations claiming to connect the world, Schools insisting they prepare you for freedom, when in reality, they prepare you for obedience. Each is draped in the language of virtue, just as the McKennas wore the mask of mercy. Each thrives because the masses accept the surface story rather than digging beneath the floorboards. But here is the brutal truth. Virtue, when used as a mask, is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because a villain who looks like a villain awakens resistance. But a villain who wears the robes of a savior disarms you before the fight even begins. Catherine and Margaret smiled, remembered names, asked about family. They built trust precisely, so betrayal would be easier to swallow. And the system today does the same. It smiles at you through screens, whispers promises of connection and opportunity, while beneath, your will is catalogued, priced, and sold. The great lesson of Leadville is this. Corruption doesn't always come with blood on its hands. Sometimes it comes with kind words, clean glasses, and gentle hymns. The most effective control systems do not chain the body first. They chain the mind. They make you grateful for your captors, thankful for the very system that feeds on you. And when you defend it, when you insist those angels of mercy could never be guilty, you complete the trap yourself. So now we arrive at the final descent. The story of the McKenna sisters was never just about two women in a saloon. It was a cipher, a code etched into history to show you how systems of power operate when the world is looking the other way. They folded dresses beneath their floorboards, catalogued names and prices, and vanished into the fog of history. But their blueprint did not vanish. It multiplied. It evolved. And it lives inside every institution that feeds on silence today. Ask yourself, how many stories like this have been erased, rewritten, or buried? How many times have you been told myths of heroes, pioneers, and saviors, while the darker truth was edited out so you would never question the structure of power you inherited? Leadville in 1881 was not unique. It was a testing ground. And once that pattern worked, once trafficking could be dressed as charity, once corruption could be wrapped in praise, the method became immortal. That is why history matters. Not the sanitized schoolbook version, but the forbidden history, the kind they tell you not to ask about. Because once you see the hidden design, you can never return to ignorance. You begin to see the masks. You recognize the saviors for what they are. Smiling captors. You notice the folded dresses of your own age, hidden not under saloon floors, but under endless distractions, headlines, and promises of safety. This is the point where most men look away, because the weight of forbidden truth is heavy. It demands something from you. It demands awareness. It demands vigilance. And more than anything, it demands that you refuse to be lulled by the mask of mercy. So I leave you with this. When you think of the McKenna sisters, don't just think of Leadville. Think of the blueprint. Think of how easily good men were deceived by kind words, how quickly entire communities fell into silence, and how many lives were consumed in that silence. Then ask, in your life, in your time, where is the mask? Who wears it? And do you have the courage to see through it? Because once you see, you can never unsee. And once you awaken, you will never belong to their system again.